listener production.
Before we begin this week's episode of Crime Insiders, please be advised that the following case study may contain content that some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. It's National Science Week, Australia's annual celebration of science and technology. In this episode of Crime Insiders Rewind, we revisit 3 episodes of our Forensics series to learn how science helps us better understand how examining the human body contributes to solving crime or even someone being exonerated, and fibre, the role that fibre plays in solving crimes. We begin with Catherine Fox's chat with forensic anthropologist Penny McArdle, who was involved in an investigation into a cold case. Police had heard discussions around the case centred on whether or not pigs can or cannot devour an entire human body without leaving a trace. It was only once the investigation began that Penny realised there was no actual official study done on whether it was true that pigs could or couldn't devour a whole body, leaving nothing behind. So Penny and her team went to work, doing what they do best.
One of the detectives and I said, hang on a minute. We've all assumed, as talk of the town, that pigs will destroy a human body and that only human teeth survive the digestive process. Let's find out. So I did some research and I found there was no research anywhere in the world that had actually tested this theory. And there were 3 other cases around the world that I could find that involved humans being left in a pig pen, and they were found shortly after they were disposed there. So the deceased was almost completely intact, nothing like what we were faced with. So then we started talking about, okay, well, we need to do some experiments, first of all, to find out if it's true, because if it's not true, if nothing is left, then it's pointless spending God knows how long excavating this pig pen. But if something does survive, then we'll have more of an idea of where we stand, like what survives and what is the potential of something surviving after 40 years as well. We were discussing this with the New South Wales Forensic Science Unit as well. So they came on board and were running the experiment, fed them a range of kangaroo slurry that the pigs would have been fed, as well as human teeth that were donated by people from a dentist as the analogue for humans, because we couldn't use humans to feed to the pigs, obviously. So we used what they used. And the results were really surprising. Yes, pigs do leave human remains. As they're chewing and munching into these large bones and small bones, the bones fall off out of their mouth and they start trampling them into the ground. So the pig pen is quite soft. So every time they get a bone and they start chewing it, large pieces fall off and it's trampled into the dirt, and they're actually saved and protected. They don't go digging for them anymore. They're buried. Their scat was also examined. Teeth do survive as well. Bone does, but only very tiny fragments survive the gut process, and the teeth were identifiable as human as well. So for a forensic anthropologist, that is just fantastic news. So what that meant for the case was we were able to go back to the pig pen. What we did was we spoke to local people who were able to identify 2 potential feeding locations where the slurry would be placed over the fence and the pigs would go there to eat. That helped us focus where our excavation would be. So we started excavating in one area and we found we weren't finding any of the evidence that we found during the experiment. So there weren't any bone pieces that were present. There weren't any teeth that were present. There wasn't anything, basically, just the odd animal bone here and there that could be accounted for by just anything and everything. Animals dying in situ and things like that. There was nothing there that matched what we found during the experiment. So we stopped that excavation there and went to the second location in the pig pen and started excavating there, and straight away we found the types of things that we were finding during the experiment. Broken bones, ranging from small right up to large pieces of bone that were easily identifiable. So we knew that we were in the right place then. Then we were able to focus our excavation in that area rather than doing the whole pig pen. So we did that and we completed that. Unfortunately, there were no human bones found, but that experiment enabled us to actually test that assumption, that theory that pigs, do they or don't they consume a whole human body or a whole carcass? No, they don't.
Dr Micah Newland is the Deputy Director at the Australian Facility for Taphonomic Experimental Research. AFTA is a facility run by the University of Technology in Sydney, which allows researchers and scientists to perform tests and experiments on bodies which have been donated. One of the critical issues is what's called time since death. If a forensics team can determine how long someone has been dead, it can help police piece together a victim's final hours, leading potentially to finding the person or persons responsible for that death, or, in the case of an accidental death, can determine if negligence was involved. Dr Newland tells former host Catherine Fox what you see on television is not always accurate.
Time since death is one of the biggest challenges in forensic science on TV, and it drives me nuts. It looks so easy. The coroner, the pathologist, whoever it is, will come out, usually someone with glasses or in a suit, the white coat. They'll have a lab coat out in the field for some reason. They'll look at the body, touch a little bit, look around. They'll be like, oh, yep, this person died Tuesday at 4 p.m.
It's more the rectal thermometer that determines the time. This degree, so they've been out here for this long. I always marvel at that. I think that's brilliant writing.
I wish it was as easy as it was on TV. It would make my life a lot easier.
Because they look and go, there's lividity, there's the blood settling, or they went from this position because they died this long ago when they've been moved. They're absolute geniuses or psychics on television.
So some of those methods we do use, but it's certainly not as precise as what it is on TV, especially if someone's been deceased for a longer period of time. It's actually quite tricky. So once we move beyond weeks and we go into months to years, it's really tricky with the methods that we currently have to determine exactly when the person died. And it's such a key piece of information that you really need to work the case around, because it's really the starting point of the case. You need to know when did the event happen so that you can then speak to witnesses.
Who can be on the suspect list, who's excluded from the suspect list.
Exactly. So time since death it's a major pillar in an investigation. And unfortunately, we still don't have a really good method for determining time since death that's very accurate beyond weeks.
Can you give us some examples of some of the research projects that are going on and how they apply in the real world in terms of forensic science and crime?
Yeah, we've got a project at the moment that's being run looking at mass disaster events. So that's a big activity that we do where we will simulate disaster events like an earthquake or a building collapse. Explosions. With explosions, just because of our ethics, we won't actually have the bodies in a vehicle, but we might blow up a vehicle and then place donors inside. So I will take law enforcement agencies, I'll take them out and I'll show them surface indication, for example. I'll do a lot of teaching on time since death. What are some of the indicators that we're looking for? How do you best recover individuals? So we'll do training where we have individuals in a grave, and we'll have law enforcement, forensic agencies come out and they'll excavate the body and any type of evidence that we've placed in there to try and make sure that they're covering all of their bases. And also the disaster events that I mentioned. At the end of the disaster period, so we usually leave the bodies there for about 2 weeks so that we can test all of the different techniques. A lot of disasters, you won't have access immediately because it's a really dangerous environment. So you don't want to take any living individuals in to go searching. So in a lot of cases, you don't actually get access to the bodies for a while. So that's why we have that longer period of time. At the end of those exercises, we'll bring law enforcement, first responders, forensic services. we'll have a massive training exercise that spans across several days where first responders will come in. They don't know anything about the scenario, so they don't know how many bodies, they don't know where they are. And it's their job to search for them and any evidence that we plant in the scenario as well. They'll go through a whole recovery exercise where we have a mobile morgue on site as well. And we'll have forensic services come in, take DNA samples, fingerprints, see if we can do facial recognition and dental as well. So as much as possible as we can do to try and improve the way we respond in a disaster event. Been running them now for the past 5 years, where we have a number of donors in a disaster scenario, and we'll try and monitor what's happening. So we'll see how the decomposition progresses, because it's quite different than in, for example, a body that's just on the surface, because we might have several victims together in something we call commingling, and that's going to affect how the body breaks down compared to how someone's by themselves will break down. And that's going to be important for us to know when it comes to the recovery and to determining what techniques we're going to use for identification, for example.
Coming up, why fibre can be critical in solving crime. Distinguished Professor Claude Roux is a pivotal figure in Australian forensic science. He's the director of the UTS Centre for Forensic Science and president of the International Association of Forensic Sciences. In this discussion with Catherine Fox, Claude discusses a case from the mid-1990s where fibre was critical in solving a murder. He tells us it's impossible for a criminal to avoid the transfer of all the different possible traces. This research is called into action after the homicide of 21-year-old student Frances Tazzoni in 1995. Her body is found in bushland by a busy northern Sydney parkway. Police arrive and establish a crime scene. An eagle-eyed crime scene investigator makes a crucial discovery of trace evidence. But as we learn in this interview with Professor Claude Roux, there are questions still unanswered.
It's a great example of the critical aspect of crime scene work, because the crime scene investigators in this case were absolutely crucial, because if they had not found what you mean as by evidence, and I would prefer to use the term trace, that would have been lost right away. Just a good example that crime scene work is absolutely essential. We could have the best science in the laboratory, but if we miss the first step, essentially everything may become irrelevant.
Frances's body, when found, was completely clothed, including shoes. What sort of shoes was she wearing?
So she was wearing lipstick boots, so kind of walking shoes with a kind of a quite coarse rubber sole.
With tread marks in the sole?
Yes, the typical pattern that you have in kind of walking shoes.
So what was the significance of those shoes that she was wearing?
The significance of these shoes were that some fibres, textile fibres, were apparent on both shoe soles. And these fibres had been noticed right away from the crime scene investigators.
So they were very visible to the naked eye?
If you look for them. So yes, they are visible, but you have to think about them and you have to look for them. And to be honest, these sort of traces may be missed. So again, it's the crucial part of crime scene work that essentially people try to find these traces, and in that case, fibres.
Can you give us a definition of what a fibre actually is?
In the forensic world, what we call fibres, it's an item that is very small in size. So usually we need to have a microscope to have a good look at it, but something very thin, very narrow, but very long. So there is a very small diameter compared to the length. A typical example of fibres, which is an animal fibre, is simply a hair. Also, in our world, we quite often focus on textile fibers. And textile fibers are the fundamental element that is used in the textile manufacture. So you put fibers together to have a thread or a yarn, and then these threads are put together to make a fabric. Essentially, when you pull apart your piece of textile to the extreme, you are just left with the fibers. And they are important to us because they transfer easily, they persist for some time, and we use fabric for a lot of things in our everyday world.
So when they find the fibres at the scene on the deceased person, I imagine if they remove the shoes, then fibres can drop off, they can be wiped off, they can just be displaced. So what happens at that scene?
Normally at a scene like that, the investigator would take proper photos, not only of the scene and the victims and everything, but if the shoes are very relevant, they take photos of the shoes and of the soles, and then close-up photos of the fibers. So all very well documented. In that case, the shoes were packaged very carefully, and everything was documented that people had to be careful that there were fibers on the shoe soles. In some cases, investigators may decide to collect the fibers separately and secure the fibers separately using tweezers and collecting these fibers in folded sheets of paper, put in Ziploc bags, or there are different ways to do that. And another way that people can do, and usually that's done at the last step, is to use sticky tape. So essentially to tape a surface to make sure that we collect everything that is on that surface.
Including dirt and other things
Including
as well.
dirt,
Plant
which
matter.
which again is very important because we shouldn't focus on only one trace type. So, the famous forensic scientist Edmond Locard was very clear that, it's impossible for a criminal to avoid the transfer of all the different possible traces. So if a criminal tries maybe to wear gloves to avoid leaving finger marks, actually then the criminal may leave glove marks.
What was significant about the fibres, and why are fibres significant?
I guess there is a very easy answer. You said that the victim was clothed. As you know, clothes are made of fabric, and the fundamental unit of a piece of fabric are actually fibers. So we've got textile fibers. And these fibers are easily transferred for most fabrics through contacts, different types of contacts. For example, when I'm finished with this interview, you can have a look at the seat, and you'll very likely find fibers from my pants, my jacket, that have been transferred onto that seat.
Just as you would find maybe hair or skin cells or anything
Exactly.
else. Right.
So fibers are a type of traces that are easily transferred, persist for some time, and that's an important point for in that case. Persist for some time, but not indefinitely. And another thing, which again very relevant to that case, fibers can be quite diverse. There are different types of fabric, so different types of what we call generic classes for the fibers. So the type of fiber, so say wool, cotton, etc. Even if it's only a small number of these sort of fibers, another thing that is added to it is the color.
The dye.
The dye. So through the analysis of the color and the type of fiber, we can already distinguish a lot of the fibers that you may find in the population. And a lot of research has found that even if you pick up a very, very common piece of garment, so you go to a very, a general store, mass-produced garment, and you use that as a reference. And then you collect fibers you find, for argument's sake, on cinema seats. And why cinema seats? Because everyone goes to the movie, you've got a good cross-section of the population.
You're sitting for a while.
And it's almost never clean, and so on. So you have a very good population of fibers. And you try to see whether you can find the same fibers, indistinguishable fibers, from the seat compared to that garment that has been sold, I don't know how many thousand times, you realize that this is extremely rare. So finding a fiber match, like we loosely said, by pure chance is uncommon.
So how on earth do you go about analysing that fibre to have anything in the world to compare it to?
The first step is to detect and recognize that the fibers are there. So in that case, it was very clear that we had a very good crime scene work. So as you mentioned, it was detected at the scene, it was secured, collected. And then the first step of the analysis is essentially good microscopy work, looking through a normal optical microscope with different types of magnification. And that already gives a first pre-identification of the type of fiber. For example, cotton, very, very easy to identify under the microscope. Wool, the same thing, with a bit of experience, very easy to identify. Man-made fibers can be a bit tricky sometimes to identify using a microscope, but a good forensic examiner, expert in fibers, would be able to go for a long way with a microscope. After that, especially for man-made fibers, we've got instrumental chemical analysis that can be done. So essentially, we can analyze then the fibers further using an instrument that essentially gives a chemical signature of the fiber and will tell you, yes, this is nylon, this is polypropylene. And even more than that, can say it's a specific type of nylon. So
Or
nylon
can it be a
6, nylon
combination?
6.
Okay, so they're categorized.
Yeah, or even sometimes there are some bicomponent fibers, and you can even analyze both sides of the bicomponent fibers.
What do you mean by that?
When you have two different polymers that are put together within a fiber.
So a combination fabric, if you had something like bamboo and elastane, or cotton and
usually
polyester,
that would be two different types of fibers
Okay.
that would be put together.
There are so many variables. What are the chances of matching fibers?
In this particular case, there is another aspect. So it's not all about the source, but it's also about the activity. So it's also about trying to use fibers to reconstruct what happened. From the number of fibers you find, where you find them, and if you know a bit the context of the case, you can go backwards from the fibers to what could have happened or what is likely to have happened, or to be more accurate, what proposition you can support using your fibers.
How long before Frances was found could those fibres been on? She's in bushland. Presumably, if she walked into the bushland, what are the chances that fibres would have stayed on the shoes? So does location of where they are, and if they're inside tread or on outside, does that matter as to where on the shoe the fibres were found?
Yes, that matters. And the number of them matters as well. And your question is absolutely spot on. That was the critical aspect in that case. So maybe I should tell you about how many fibers and what were found in that case, so we can maybe dig in a bit further.
Because this is so intriguing that a simple thing like a
Yes.
fibre, and yet you said so many challenges face you, and yet they were critical in the conviction in this case.
Yes, so what happened is there were a number of fibers found on both shoe soles. So there were 26 black polyester, 5 blue polypropylene, and 5 grey polypropylene fibers that were recovered from the right shoe, and 4 grey polypropylene, 7 blue polypropylene, and 24 black polyester from the left. Yeah, so here the first assumption was essentially to find where these fibers could come from and have some good critical thinking. The first question would be, what kind of fabric could leave fibers on the shoe sole? Very quickly you realize the most logical item is a carpet. So the first thing was investigative work to go around all the places where the victim had been the few days before her disappearance and see whether they could find carpets that would be similar to these fibers. Police went to the university library, home, and so on, and they found no similar fibers in her environment. Now, because of the police work, a person of interest was identified, her ex-boyfriend. This person of interest owned a 1991 Honda CRX, and there were carpets in this vehicle. So some samples from that carpet were taken and analyzed, and they applied the same analytical scheme to the fibers that were found on the shoe sole. And what they found were that they couldn't discriminate the fibers from the car carpet to the fibers found on the shoe soles. So essentially, the car carpet was made of 60% grey polypropylene, 15% blue polypropylene, and 25% black polyester. So you can see we have again these black polyester, blue polypropylene, and grey polypropylene. This particular carpet was manufactured in Japan and was only used in 1990 and 1991 Honda CRX vehicles. 296 of these vehicles had been sold in Australia. Affidavits were obtained from the owners of 291 of these cars, each claiming not to have been in the area where the deceased was found from the 29th of March to the 2nd of April 1995.
All of those owners signed affidavits saying, I wasn't there.
Yes, only 5 vehicles were unaccounted for, one of which was the suspect's vehicle. Interestingly, in this case, the defense had an expert who came and put a question mark around exactly this question of differential shedding. Because if you've paid attention to what I was saying, the proportions you have of the 3 different types of fibers between the number of fibers on the shoe soles and what was in the carpet, they do not match. So that was used by an expert from the defense saying these fibers cannot come from that carpet because the proportions are not the same. And as a forensic scientist, you know that you have to account for this phenomenon of differential shedding. What we did in that case, one of the first things we did was to do experimental work, experimental research, essentially to test whether this differential shedding aspect was occurring with that carpet. So we used a machine called an abrasion tester, which is a machine used in the textile industry where we can make frictions between two
rub it.
Two fabrics. So we rub it. And we did that a lot of times, say 10 times. And we realized that the proportions between each experiment were highly variable. So in one case, we may have the grey polypropylene as the most common type of fiber transferred. Another case, that would be the black polyester.
So you didn't confirm the defendant's scientists saying there's no way this can come from the carpet. What you did was reaffirm that it could have come from that carpet.
Yeah, essentially that argument saying that the proportions are different, hence it cannot come from that carpet. What we showed is it's impossible to make an inference based on these proportions because every transfer experiment may lead to different types of proportions.
So that removed some of the doubt.
Yes, exactly. That removed doubt in relation to the various proportions of fibers being transferred. It's an argument that we can rule out. So that was very important because quite often in forensic science, we are criticized that a lot of people base their conclusions or findings or interpretation on thin air, don't have empirical data, and actually we got this empirical data for that aspect, so for that particular question.
Was that during the trial?
Yes, that's correct. What's interesting here is that the source question, whether finding matching fibers in that case support the proposition that it comes from that carpet as opposed to any other source, was not an issue in court once we had ruled out, this issue of differential shedding.
So if the defence is accepting that those fibres did come from his car, presumably they're using the defence that, well, of course she'd been in his car, So you wouldn't be surprised if she'd left fingerprints in his car, or his clothing or his car seat was on her clothing as well, fibres from that. So presumably they would then try and argue that those fibres had been on those shoes for a while. Because
Exactly.
the defendant said he hadn't seen her for at least 6 weeks or something like that.
Yes, exactly. You are perfectly spot on. In cases like that, the source question is not the critical one. It's more the activity question. It's more, how and when especially these fibers could be transferred. That was a very important question. And that was actually the critical question in court. It's a perfectly valid argument. She was in a relationship with the defendant. So, of course, she has left traces of herself, of her garments, and so on in the environment, and vice versa. The issue is the timing. So the whole question became, is it possible for fibers to first be transferred from a car carpet to shoe soles when someone sits in a car? And then the next question was, for how long these fibers will remain
on the shoes.
On the shoes.
Like we said, it was bushland, so presumably
Exactly.
if she'd walked across grass or gravel, there could have been abrasions that actually removed the fibres, or they were replaced in the tread with dirt or grass or whatever.
Exactly. So even if previous research can give us, some guidance to interpret a case like that, we wanted to have empirical data specific to that case. It was very interesting because we were just starting the forensic science honors program at UTS. So it was the first cohort of students. So we could use one student and then a whole class for some of the experiments to essentially recreate, to mimic some of the activity that could happen in a car with someone sitting in a car, and then the persistence, So we had offcuts from the shoe manufacturer. So we had a lot of these, just the soles. So that was very interesting. And we used Velcro to essentially for people to put that on, on their own shoes. And we recreated some situations, and we asked students first to transfer the fibers, and then we asked a whole class of students to walk around the lab and to walk around different surfaces and so on, using the particular car carpet that was relevant to that case, and see essentially how these fibers would remain. And first, whether they would transfer, whether there would be differences depending on the type of shoe and shoe soles. And even we had the research student in that case who went to Canberra with the AFB and had access to the car to recreate some sitting and the car braking and things like that with the actual car to see how many fibers would transfer in a case like that.
Could you then, as a consequence, then have them walk for a period of time to see how long or how much walking required to actually displace them?
She tried a lot of different experiments there, and what we found first is the number of fibers that were transferred were quite comparable to the number of fibers that were found in that case. So yes, that it's possible that you can have that transfer, but the more critical questions was really about the time and the persistence. So what we found is that most fibers would be lost within 5 minutes of walking on most surfaces. And more importantly, after half an hour, in all of our experiments, no fibers were remaining on the shoe soles. So that was extremely significant for the case.
Especially since Frances was at university at Macquarie Uni that day, and then got a train to supposedly meet her ex-boyfriend. So that would give you that time frame that the fibres should have been removed. What then happened with that evidence in the trial?
There was an expert for the defence who came, an expert in engineering, more than forensic science. And in his report, he had done a few experiments, but in his report, he had said that fibres could persist for a long time and things like that, while actually our experiments that were proper experiments, clearly we showed that was not possible. So these fibers, and especially when it's combined with this notion that fibres are not going to persist for long on shoe soles for someone alive and walking, were absolutely critical in that case. And that was the only forensic evidence. Everything else in the case was
circumstantial. Yes.
Yeah.
The case then, the prosecutors have a circumstantial case against the ex-boyfriend because he, of course, denies having seen the victim for 6 weeks and claimed he was at work. People at work said he'd left work. There was no one to corroborate his version of events. So again, it's all circumstantial. And they had a possible motive because she'd rejected him and he'd allegedly already tried to solicit someone to kill her. They still need evidence. You need motive, means, opportunity, but you also need to tie that person. So your evidence and your findings were absolutely critical in this case.
Yes, absolutely, because essentially what it shows is that the victim did not walk much after sitting in the car. Looking at our experiments, a time frame of half an hour would be kind of the maximum boundary. So essentially we can say, there is no substantial time after the victim sat in the car. And by substantial time, we really mean minutes and not hours or longer.
And given where she was found, there's no way she walked there herself, particularly given that there were neck markings at post-mortem and the cause of death was deemed strangulation. The boyfriend, John Serratore, was convicted.
That's all we have time for in this special Science Week episode of Crime Insiders Rewind. National Science Week is a nationwide celebration of science and technology, with hundreds of events held across the country in schools, universities, libraries, museums, parks, and online. It's designed to make science accessible, fun, and relevant for everyone, from curious kids to lifelong learners. I'm Dan Mullins, with sound design by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.